So thank you, and it's wonderful to be here, however briefly. I was at the European University Institute in June before my summer break. I'm very happy to be here in December before my winter break. I hope every year, twice, I can come back just before my breaks. So in the context of this talk, I want to introduce the ideas with really two separate thoughts. So here's the first. I titled my talk, The Integrity and Independence of Policymakers. And what I want you to do is to recognize the way in which these concepts are related to the concepts of trust. Policymakers have to be trusted, and they will be trusted if trustworthy. These two T concepts relate in a particular way to the central notion I want you to see, independence. Trust is a function of the independence of policymakers, and independence is related to their integrity. Now, by independence, I want to suggest a very specific meaning. Here's an example. Think about the independent judiciary. By an independent judiciary, nobody means a judiciary that can do whatever the hell they want. That's not the sense of independence. What independence means in the context of a judiciary is a judiciary that is dependent upon the law. We understand independence by understanding the relevant dependence. And I want to suggest that's true here and elsewhere. Independence is a function of proper dependence, and by the negation of this, improper dependence entails this loss of independence. Okay, that's the first idea. Here's the second. Many lawyers, I'm high on this list, are really physicists' wannabes. I couldn't be a physicist, so I had to be a lawyer. And physicists are obsessed with this idea of anomalies. Whole fields of science get born by focusing on the anomaly. So I want to suggest two anomalies here. The first relates to this period, the beginning of 2011. In the first quarter of 2011 in the United States, if I asked you what was the #1 issue that the United States Congress focused upon, the #1 issue, the issue that consumed most of the time on the floor of Congress and most of the time in committees. You know, a lot of issues the United States was facing at the time. We were in the middle of 2 wars. We had an unemployment crisis. There was a debt crisis. We're still in the middle of a climate crisis. There was a poverty crisis. We could say there was crises all over the place at the beginning of 2011. So what was the #1 issue which Congress spent its time addressing? And the answer is the bank swipe fee controversy. Now you're thinking, I'm European, I don't know what the bank swipe fee controversy is, but the truth is 99.9% of Americans also don't know what the bank swipe fee controversy is. What the bank swipe fee controversy is the question of when you use your debit cards, how much money do the banks get, and how much money do the retailers have to pay. And Congress needs to address that because they set that price in the context of the regulation of debit cards. And this issue dominated Congress's agenda. And that's the anomaly. How is it this issue, which may be issue 1,444 on the most important issues that Congress might possibly address, how is it that that issue was #1 on the list? The anomaly. Here's a second kind of anomaly. Gallup, every 4 years, does a poll asking Americans, what's the top issues that the next president needs to address? And in the poll they did in July, #2 on that list was, quote, reducing corruption in the federal government. 87% of Americans, just as many Democrats as Republicans, said reducing corruption in the federal government was a top issue. Now, this is the first time this issue was on the top 10. And by corruption, Americans are not referring to bribery or any criminal act, because we've not had any of that kind of corruption in the federal government for more than half a decade. By corruption, Americans are thinking about money in politics. They're thinking about Citizens United and the explosion of super PACs. So this was the #2 issue in Americans' minds, second only to creating jobs. But when you turn to the political campaigns, and look for this issue on the issues they address, the issue goes dark. Neither Obama nor Romney even mention the issue on their web pages. It's indeed the only issue not mentioned from the top 10 on both of these party candidates' websites. And it's the first time in as long as we can see that an issue on the top 10 of the Gallup poll is not addressed by either political party in the context of a presidential race. That's a second anomaly. And the question these anomalies point to is a fundamental problem that I want to say is at the center of democracy in America. And that's the question I want to talk about here. So here's the problem. To introduce the problem, I'm going to tell a story. All stories begin like this. So once upon a time, there was a place called Lesterland. Now, it was a comprehensive introduction. I appreciate its comprehensiveness, but it didn't include the fact that my first name is Lester. It's a secret, so I don't want you to tell anybody about that. But my first name's Lester, so I'm allowed to make fun of Lester. So here's a story that makes fun of Lester's. Lesterland looks a lot like the United States, has about 310 million people, and like the United States, 144,000 of those people are named Lester. So 0.05% of Lesterland is named Lester. Now in Lesterland, Lesters have a certain kind of power. There are 2 elections every election cycle in Lesterland. One of them is the general election. The other is the Lester election. Now in the Lester election, only Lesters get to vote. But in the general election, all citizens over 18, in some states if you have an ID, get to vote. But here's the trick. To be able to run in the general election, you must do extremely well in the Lester election. You don't necessarily have to win, but you must do extremely well. So here's the picture of democracy in Lesterland. What can we say about Lesterland? Well, we can say, number one, as the Supreme Court said in Citizens United, that the people in Lesterland have the ultimate influence over elected officials. Because after all, there is a general election in which all the people get to participate. But the people have that power only after the Lesters have had their way with the candidates who wish to run in the general election. Number two, obviously, this dependence upon the Lesters will produce a subtle, understated, camouflaged bending to keep these Lesters happy. And number three, reform that angers the Lesters is, we could say, highly unlikely. Okay, so this is Lesterland. And there are 3 things I want you to learn from this metaphor of Lesterland. Number one, the United States is Lesterland. The United States is Lesterland. The United States also looks like this. It also has 2 elections. One election is called the general election. The other election we should call the money election. In the general election, all citizens get to vote if you're over 18 and you happen to have an ID in certain states. In the money election, it's the funders who get to vote. And as in Lesterland, to be allowed to run in the general election, you must do extremely well in the money election. You don't necessarily have to win, but you must do extremely well. And here's the key to this metaphor. There are just as few relevant funders in America as there are Lesters in Lesterland. Now you say, really? 0.05%? Well, here are the numbers from this election cycle. 0.3% of Americans gave $200 or more to any federal candidate in the election that happened in 2012. 0.055% gave the maximum amount the law permits, $2,500, to any candidate in a federal election in the election in 2012. 0.01%, the 1% of the 1%, gave $10,000 or more to all federal candidates combined. 0.0003% gave $100,000 or more to all federal candidates combined. And my favorite statistic, 0.000042%, for those of you doing the numbers, you know that's 132 Americans, gave 60% of the super PAC money spent in the election in 2012. 132 Americans. So I'm a lawyer. I look at this range of numbers, 0.3 to 0.01. I think it's fair for me to say that 0.05% is a fair estimate of the relevant funders, and in this sense I would say the funders are our Lesters. Now, as we can say about Lesterland, this is what we can say about USA Land. Number one, Supreme Court's completely right. The people have the ultimate influence over the elected officials, but they have that ultimate influence in their general election only after the funders have had their way with the candidates who wish to run in the general election. And number two, obviously, this dependence upon the funders produces a subtle and understated and camouflaged bending to keep the funders happy. Candidates for Congress in the United States spend anywhere from 30 to 70% of their time raising money to get back to Congress or to get their party back into power. And as they do that, they develop, as any of us would, a sixth sense, a constant awareness about how what they do might affect their ability to raise money. They become, in the words of the X-Files, shape-shifters, as they constantly adjust their views in light of what they know will help them to raise money, not on issues 1 to 10, but on issues 11 to 1,000. Lessig, a Democrat from Virginia, describes that when she went to Congress, she was told by a colleague, quote, "Always lean to the green." Then to clarify, she went on, he was not an environmentalist. And then point number three, reform that angers these funders is in USA Land, we could say, highly unlikely. So that's the first point. The United States is Lesterland. Here's the second point. The United States is worse than Lesterland. Worse than Lesterland. Because in Lesterland, you can imagine if we Lesters got a letter from the government that said, you guys get to pick who the candidates are who will run in the general election. There are Lesters of every economic class, there are black Lesters and white Lesters, not many women Lesters, but put that aside for a second. If we got this letter, you can at least imagine that we Lesters would begin to think we have to act in the interest of Lesterland. It's at least conceivable that we would aspire to an aristocratic attitude, believing that it's our job to choose candidates who will help the country as a whole. It's at least possible that the Lesters in Lesterland act for the good of Lesterland. But in our land, in this land, in USA Land, the Lesters act for the Lesters, because the shifting coalitions of interests that comprise the 0.05% are interests that come together because of the issues on the horizons in the election. So if it's global warming legislation on the horizon, it's coal companies and oil companies who comprise a significant portion of the 0.05%. If it's healthcare reform, it's pharmaceutical companies or insurance companies or doctors who comprise the 0.05%. Regardless of the issue, a different coalition comes together, and they come together not demanding legislation in the public interest, but to the contrary, legislation that's directed to their private interests. So in this sense, the USA, I think, is certainly worse than Lesterland. But then point number three, whatever one wants to say about Lesterland against the background of its traditions, in our land, in our Lesterland, in USA Land, this conflicting dependence between the funders and the people is a kind of corruption. Now, by corruption, I don't mean brown paper bag corruption with cash secreted to members of Congress. I don't mean Rob Blagojevich corruption, where candidates or members are trying to buy influence through the use of political power. Everything I'm talking about is perfectly legal. I'm not describing any illegal act by anyone. Instead, by corruption, I mean corruption relative to the framers' baseline, the understanding they had about how the government would function. So the framers of our Constitution gave us what they called a republic. But by a republic, they meant a representative democracy. And by a representative democracy, they meant, as Federalist 52 puts it, a democracy that would have a branch that would be, quote, dependent upon the people alone. So here's the model of government. We have the people, and we have the government. I'll do my own slide. Just pull away that bounces like that. Okay, so the people and the government, right? An exclusive dependency, and so would the public good be found through this exclusive dependency. But here's the problem. Congress has evolved a different dependence. No longer a dependence upon the people alone, but increasingly a dependence upon the funders. Well, the point is, this is a dependence too, but it's different and conflicting from a dependence on the people alone, so long as the funders are not the people. Now, what does this corruption do? Well, I want you to see this in a particular way. It requires me to brainwash you on the process to seeing this in this particular way. So let's start with examples to get this brainwashing done. As you heard, for many years I worked in the area of copyright. I became a copyright activist on October 27, 1998, when Congress passed and the President signed into law a statute in honor of this great American, the Sonny Bono Copyright Term Extension Act. Now, this was a statute that extended the term of existing copyrights by 20 years. And the question Congress was supposed to be asking when it passed this statute was, did it advance the public good to extend the term of existing copyrights by 20 years? Now, we recognize copyright is a necessary incentive for certain kinds of creativity, a monopoly granted for the purpose of creating incentives. But as we also recognize in this universe, not Star Trek's universe, but this universe at least, incentives are prospective. No matter what the United States Congress does, it can't get George Gershwin to produce anything more. So when you ask the question, does extending the term of existing copyright advance the public good? It's a perfectly easy answer. The answer is obviously no. Indeed, when we brought a challenge to this statute in the Supreme Court and had a brief signed by 20 economists, including 5 Nobel Prize winners, including this liberal this is Milton Friedman, right-wing Nobel Prize-winning economist. Friedman said he would sign the brief only if the word no-brainer was somewhere in the brief. So obvious was it that you couldn't advance the public good by extending the term of an existing copyright. But there were apparently no brains in this place when Congress unanimously passed the statute extending the term of existing copyright. What there was more than $6 million from Disney and related companies eager to see their copyrights extended, the public good be damned. Well, here's another example. Wall Street Journal, two years ago, had this puzzle about the rise of what they call the temporary tax code in the United States. And by the temporary tax code, they meant the number of provisions in our tax system which are explicitly scheduled to end. And when they come up to end, Congress has to decide whether to extend them. And what that produces is what the journal called extender mania. As Congress passes these bills to extend these particular provisions, after being pushed by people interested in passing these provisions to have them extended. And the question the journal asked was, why is it we see this explosion in temporary provisions? Well, temporary provisions were born in our tax code with Ronald Reagan's 1981 Research and Development Tax Credit. This provision was made temporary so as to test it, because the Democrats said it wouldn't work, the Republicans said it would work, so they said, let's just make it temporary, and then at the end of the period, we'll ask a bunch of economists, and if they think it worked, we'll make it permanent. If they don't think it worked, we'll repeal it. So after a period of time, they asked the question, did it work? And the answer was, it did. Republican and Democrat economists alike thought it was a great tax credit idea because it spurred a kind of investment that otherwise would not have occurred, and therefore made sense absolutely to be within our tax code. Here's the puzzle. It is still temporary in our tax code. Still temporary. 30 years after this temporary provision was added, it is still temporary despite the fact everyone agrees it makes sense to be within our tax code. So why is it temporary? Well, Rebecca Kaisar writes in the Georgia Law Review, the principal recipients of the research credit are large U.S. manufacturing corporations. These business entities are more than willing to invest in lobbying activities and campaign donations to ensure continuance of this large tax savings. And the point's made a little bit more strongly by this right-wing think tank, as they put it. The cycle has repeated itself for years. Congress allows the credit to lapse until another short extension is given, preceded, of course, by a series of fundraisers and speeches about the importance of nurturing innovation. Congress essentially uses this cycle to raise money for re-election promising industry more predictability the next time around. And the point to recognize is how this dynamic has become central to how Washington works. We architect tax policy in part to make funding the government easier, but also to make it easier to raise money for political campaigns. And not just tax policy. Al Gore, shortly after he invented the internet, that was a cheap shot, but after Al Gore became vice president, he had an idea about restructuring the regulatory infrastructure for telecommunications as it affected the internet. And the idea was basically to take DSL, as it was regulated under telecom, and cable, as it was regulated under Title VI of the Communications Act, and put it into a new title, Title VII. And Title VII would be fundamentally deregulated. And so he took this idea to Capitol Hill, and the chief policy architect who sold this idea to Capitol Hill reported to me that when they took the idea there for the first time, the response they got back from Capitol Hill was, hell no, if we deregulate these guys, how are we going to raise money from them? And so the dynamic suggested here is that we tax in part to raise money for campaigns, we regulate in part to help make it easy to raise money for campaigns by increasing the range of people over whom regulators have this power of effective extortion. And this both points to the way in which money is playing two roles inside of fiscal policy in the United States. So here's a third example. We'll focus, of course, on the regulations around Wall Street after the collapse on Wall Street, which then brought the rest of the economy down. What was it that explains that collapse? Well, Johnson and Quack in this book point to what they describe as a perverse mix of both too little government and too much government. So too little government in the form of deregulation. Of course, during the 1990s, we saw an explosion of financial innovations, otherwise known as derivatives. But these innovations were effectively invisible to the market because of a series of regulatory changes that made it so these assets were not required to be subject to the same requirements for transparency and publicity that were the rules for every other asset traded in this economy. So, for example, my colleague Frank Partnoy calculated that in 1980, 98% of the assets traded in the economy were traded subject to these traditional New Deal rules. But by 2008, 90% of the assets traded in this economy were exempted from these traditional rules, not subject to publicity, transparency, or traded on a public exchange, encouraging the shadow banking market, which then encouraged the bubble, which when it burst, took down the rest of the economy. But that alone was not enough, Johnson and Quack suggest. In addition to too little government, there was also too much government. Because throughout the 1990s, the government sent a clear beacon to the financial industry that there was, in effect, a government guarantee that when this bubble burst, there would be, in effect, a bailout on the other side, producing what is the dumbest form of socialism ever invented by man. We socialized the risk, but we privatized the benefit. Now, I know some of you are lawyers, so this will be clear to you. It's a technical legal term, but this is an insanely stupid way to regulate a financial system. And all of that is before 2008. After 2008, we have the classic insult added to injury here, because after 2008, after the worst crisis since the Depression, after all who were not associated with that crisis directly, from the left and the right, linked the crisis in large part to the system of misregulation. After the dean of deregulation, Alan Greenspan, testified to Congress that he had made a mistake in believing that the banks would act in the public interest as opposed to in their own private interest. After all of that, the banks were still powerful enough to blackmail both the Democrats and the Republicans into giving them an essentially get-out-of-jail-free card for their behavior up to the crisis in 2008, and leaving in place the essential structural feature that makes the financial system unstable. The banks are too big to fail. And indeed, if they were too big to fail in 2008, they are only too bigger to fail in 2012 because of the series of regulations that have allowed them to stay and grow only bigger. Now, what is it that explains this craziness in regulatory policy? Well, there are lots of theories, but here's the one thing we know. The fastest growing sectors in contributions to political campaigns from the 1990s to 2012 have been the financial and security sectors. And in 2010, the largest sector contributing to financial campaigns came from finance, insurance, real estate industries in the United States. Right, here's one final example. I'm sure some of you saw these images of the Deepwater Horizon catastrophe. You asked a question that many Americans ask, which is, how is it that this experimental drilling technology could be permitted without extensive environmental impact and risk studies? After all, where I come from, we've just completed the regulatory evaluation for a clean energy project. It took 9 years and 10,000 pages of environmental analysis before this project was permitted to go forward. So when they built the Deepwater Horizon, exactly how much regulatory review was required to permit this to be constructed? The answer is 17 pages of environmental analysis before the project was exempted from any further environmental review. Now when Congress heard this, of course, Congress was shocked.
I'm shocked. You're winning, sir. Thank you very much.
Yet, of course, it had been Congress that had required these fast-track approval processes, and you asked, why did Congress approve fast-track approval, even in the context of these experimental platforms? And the answer is, lots of possible reasons. The one thing we can point to is endless campaign cash towards this particular policy. Now, here's the point. No respectable liberal or libertarian or conservative could defend these cases. Each of them is an abomination from any of these political perspectives. So how is it they become part of regulatory policy in the United States? Political scientists are uncertain. They say the issue is complex, but here's the thing I'm confident of. You believe you know. All I have to do is point to the money, and you believe you understand the root cause to this craziness. And here's then my claim. It is because of cases like this that, number one, Americans believe, and Americans are right to believe, but let's put this aside for a second. Americans believe money buys results in Congress, quote unquote. 75% of Americans, according to a poll conducted for a book that I published last fall, a little bit higher Democrats than Republicans, but I guarantee you before the Republicans took control of the House, it was just as many Republicans as Democrats. So here's the one thing all Americans believe: money buys results in Congress. Leading to point number two. That belief erodes trust in the institution of Congress. ABC and the New York Times found that confidence in Congress last year was at 9%. 9%. Right? We should put this in some context. It's certainly the case at the time of the American Revolution that a higher percentage of Americans had confidence in the British Crown than have confidence in our Congress today. And that leads to point number three. This erosion erodes participation in the political process. Rock the Vote, which organizes and turns out young voters, and in 2008 turned out the largest number of young voters in the history of American elections, found in 2010 a significant number of their voters were not going to show up. They asked them why. The number one reason by far was this: no matter who wins, corporate interests will still have too much power and to prevent real change. And it's not just kids. The vast majority of people who could have voted in 2010 did not vote, in part at least because of this belief. And even in this election, 40% of the people who could have voted did not vote, in part at least because of this belief. And finally, point number four. Let's go back to the claim I said that Americans were right about. Americans are right that money buys results in Congress. What sort of results? What are the results that these Lesters want? Well, think of the major issues that define what Congress doesn't do. Climate change. The oil and coal industries have a free resource, given the status quo. It is the resource to be able to expend carbon without internalizing the cost of that externality. They want to keep it, that free resource. The pharmaceutical and insurance industries have a protected market, given the status quo. Pharmaceutical industries have a protected market through patent protection and guarantees that they will not have to negotiate prices with the government. The insurance industry has a protected market because there's a mandate to buy insurance, but there's no open competition to force that price for that insurance down. But they want to keep that protected market. And Wall Street has basically a subsidized gamble in the financial markets that they're gambling, knowing that if in fact they fail, the government will back them up. They want to keep that subsidized gamble. So across all of these industries and many more, what these Lesters want is nothing. They want not a thing. They want no change. They want to stop any reform that might adjust the status quo benefits which they get. And the critical point to recognize is that it is trivially easy, given the way the American government has developed, for them to achieve this objective, pointing to the basic instability and irrationality inside of the way this government functions. Because in a world where the relevant funders are 0.05% of the population, it is simple to gather together the numbers you need to comprise the interest sufficient to block the reform you want to stop. The system is distorted so long as money is the target of the attention that Congress focuses as Congress does its job. This is the target that explains the anomalies that I began with at the beginning. So why did the bank swipe fee controversy dominate the agenda? Well, as Zach Carter and Ryan Green put it, the clock never ticks down to zero in Washington. 1 year's law is the next year's repeal targets. Politicians showered with cash from card companies and giant retailers alike have been moving back and forth between camps, paid handsomely for their shifting allegiances. So the very agenda of what Congress works on is driven in part by the recognition that certain issues will pay them and certain issues will not. And why was this the #2 issue, but not mentioned by either political campaign? Well, at least there's a little bit of recognition of shame by both of these parties, recognizing that if they mention this issue, people would believe them hypocritical because they're depending upon this large money at the same time that they would be criticizing. This is the sense of corruption that exists inside this democracy. It is what we could call dependence corruption. It is the corruption of an industry, of an institution that has achieved the wrong conflicting dependence. Now, in American political science, people point to what they say are the other problems, more important than they say, than money inside of politics. So, Tom Mann and Norm Ornstein in this book say the fundamental problem is the polarization of the political system. As Rick Klein, the political columnist for the Washington Post, says, no, fundamental problem is the filibuster in our Senate, where one senator or a small number of senators can block any move inside the Senate. But the critical thing to recognize about both of these problems is how they are directly linked to the issue of fundraising. So if you think of a political system where members of Congress spend between 30 and 70% of their time raising money, where this has not yet been published, but it will be published soon, the Democrats just recently sent a memo to all of their incoming freshman members of Congress. And in this memo, they had the memo was a form of a PowerPoint slide deck. They had a slide which described the schedule that members of Congress were expected to live under. So, as I said, this is not the actual slide, but this is basically what I was told by a member the slide says. This is your schedule. And they said, we will supervise to make sure you live up to your schedule. Every day, which they count as 9 hours, you will spend 4 hours fundraising. Then you will spend 2 hours in meet and greets, which are basically more fundraising. You will spend 2 hours doing the work of Congress, reading bills, voting, discussing, building coalitions. And you will spend 1 hour doing the work of your constituents, meaning dealing with problems your constituents might have. So 6 of the 9 hours are devoted to fundraising. And that's not even counting the evenings, which are uniformly evenings devoted to further fundraising events. So when you begin to think about what psychologically it means to be living inside of a system, you begin to recognize the sense in which Congress has become an addict here, addicted to this project of raising money. And when you're an addict, the thing you think about is, what's the easiest thing I can sell off to fund my addiction? And inside of a constitutional system of democracy like the United States, the easiest thing to sell is the capacity to veto reform or changes, the ability to block reform or changes. That's the one thing, the one resource you can be certain of, because you can't be certain that you can actually sell the ability to pass legislation. There's thousands of ways to stop legislation and only one way to pass legislation. So this becomes the thing you want to sell. And when you recognize that, you can see the way polarization and filibuster facilitate the ability to veto change. And these, I think, then are symptoms, not the disease. The disease is the dependency, the improper dependence, which produces this loss of independence because of the improper dependence. This is the non-trustworthy, not trusted policymaker at the core of what the American government does. Okay, now, this dependence corruption is just an instance of what I want to think of as a more general concept called institutional corruption. And institutional corruption can be thought of metaphorically if we think about this device. You know what this is, a compass. This device, you know what that is, a magnet. The relationship between these two devices together produces a phenomenon called magnetic deviation. Magnetic deviation, of course, is the deviation of the compass from its intended direction, north, or at least magnetic north. That deviation is the corruption. It is the corruption of the purpose of the device or of the institution, steering the institution away from its intended aim. That's the sense of institutional corruption. Now, the steering, of course, is not criminal. It's just a magnet, right? It's not bribery. It's not any violation of existing rules. What it is a certain kind of influence within an economy of influence that has a certain effect. It's institutional corruption if it weakens the effectiveness of the institution, especially by weakening public trust in that institution. That's the sense in which I offer institutional corruption here. So Congress is, in my view, the paradigm case. But once you see that structure, people ask, are there others, other institutions that are subject to the same kind of deviation? And there are plenty that are alleged. Let me just suggest a couple here. I don't mean to assert that these are instances. I just want you to see the pattern which would suggest that they could be. So think in the context of medicine, context in particular about pharmaceutical research. Pharmaceutical industry in the United States, of course, is a huge industry. In 2008, it was $234 billion. In that same year, $20 billion was spent to market drugs in the United States. And in that marketing, $12 billion was spent on something called detailing. Now, what detailing is where pharmaceutical representatives give samples and gifts to doctors or nurses or people in hospital administration to get them to try or to adopt certain new drugs. As one detailer put it, the essence of pharmaceutical gifting is bribes that aren't considered bribes. Well, it's the doctor's job to treat patients and not to justify their actions. It's my job, the detailer said, to constantly sway the doctors. It's a job I'm paid and trained to do. Doctors are neither trained nor paid to negotiate. Most of the time, they don't even realize that's what they are doing. Now, there are complex claims here, but what institutional corruption would ask is, does this influence change prescribing behavior, or does it change trust in prescribing advice? So that's the structure of medicine. Think about the academy. In 2008, I was asked by the United States Senate to testify about network neutrality. Midway through my testimony, I received on my iPhone a text from this guy, Senator Sununu. Senator Sununu texted me, "You shouldn't be shilling for big internet companies." And I had this kind of startled reaction. That's what this exclamation point means here, startled. Thinking, oh my God, he thinks that I'm being paid to give testimony. And I thought, well, of course he thinks I'm being paid to give this testimony, because increasingly people are paid to give testimony in this field all over the place. place. I had one colleague who received $50,000 to write an article about network neutrality from a cable company. Not surprisingly, the article was against the idea of network neutrality. And then when he published that article, he forgot to put in the first footnote the fact that he had been paid $50,000 to write this article. It was an accident, he told me. But the point is, this dynamic increasingly makes people in the positions that this Senator Sununu was in skeptical, wondering, is this just a product of the money, or is it a product of what you actually believe? So institutional corruption would ask, does this influence change the testimony, or does it change trust in the testimony? And just to be clear, I've never taken money for public testimony, and nor do I think one ought to. Or think of the context of rating agencies in 2008. Wall Street, of course, is regulated, quote unquote, by these private agencies. The government has basically outsourced the regulation to these agencies. These agencies rate bonds, and those ratings are supposed to guide the market in deciding which risks are, what the risks are with any financial instrument. But these agencies, over the course of the last 20 years, have adopted a new kind of business model. The business model is that the issuer of the bond hires the rater. So if you have a bond issue, you go out and you find a rating agency, and you pay them money, and then they rate the bond. But that dynamic, should have been obvious, creates an obvious conflict. As the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission put it, because issuers could choose which rating agencies to do business with, and because the agencies depended upon issuers for their revenues, rating agencies felt pressure to give favorable ratings so that they might remain competitive. Or as Lowenstein put it a little bit more colorfully, imagine the big rating agencies as three competitive saloons standing side by side, with each free to set its own drinking age. Before long, 9-year-olds would be downing bourbon. Right? So this dynamic in the context of institutional corruption asks, does this competition among these private regulators change the quality of the ratings? Or separately, does it change trust in the quality of the ratings? Or finally, in the context of journalism, this book, The Death and Life of American Journalism, tries to understand what explains the destruction of journalism in the United States. Most people think it's the internet, or this man, Craig Newmark, who created Craigslist. And this book says that, of course, those influences are real, but the real decline in journalism actually happens long before the internet. As they write, the big change came in the late 1970s and 80s when large chains accelerated the long-term trend to gobble up daily newspapers. And the claim here is that the change tied to the structure of ownership, that these were publicly traded companies, changed the incentives inside of newspapers to engage in what we traditionally think of as journalism. When locally based family-owned newspapers were consolidated into publicly owned newspaper chains, an essential trust between journalism and the community served was betrayed. So the claim is a type of ownership corrupted the institution, Institutional Corruption Act. Does this influence having publicly traded companies change journalism, or does it change trust in journalism? Two separate questions. Okay, now, the point is all of these fit the form, but they raise two different questions. Number one, proof that indeed there is the kind of corruption that this form describes. And number two, suggestion of a remedy. The proof is always going to be difficult. Counterfactuals here are too complex. The remedies are not always difficult. Some remedies are at least conceptually simple. So think again about the example of corruption in Congress. If there's a systemic problem here, namely that the funders are not the people, that suggests an obvious systemic solution to make it so the funders are the people, to give Congress a way to fund their elections without fouls, without selling their souls and thereby alienating America into believing that they are just selling their votes to the highest bidder. And one way to do this, I increasingly think the only way to do this, is to think of citizen-funded campaigns. So we now have a system where essentially the top 1% has 10 times per capita the influence of the bottom 99% combined. We need a system where the influence, regardless of income level, is roughly equivalent. Systems like vouchers given out to people to help fund campaigns, as Bruce Ackerman in Millionaires first described, as I've modified in the context of the book that I published last year, would be one way to do this. everybody has a voucher which they hand to candidates who agree to fund with vouchers only, producing a system where it would be only citizens, and at least the potential for all citizens, to be contributing towards a candidate's election, so that candidates, though dependent upon their funders, would not be dependent on the Lesters alone, but would be dependent upon the wide range of people in the business of funding elections. So just as we have the principle, one person, one vote, this would be one person, one voucher, producing the democratic influence that Lesterland negates. So that's conceptually simple. But conceptually simple doesn't mean the solution is easy. So Jim Cooper, congressman from Tennessee, who's been in Congress for as long as all but about 20 other members of Congress, explained the complexity here to me. He said, you have to understand, Congress and Capitol Hill has become a kind of farm league for K Street. K Street is where all the lobbyists work. So the claim is, farm league for K Street means people on Capitol Hill, members and staffers and bureaucrats, have an increasingly common business model in their head. The business model is focused on their life after government, their life as lobbyists. So 50% of the Senate between 1998 and 2004 left to become lobbyists. 42% of the House, those numbers have only gone up. And as United Republic calculated last spring, looking at a bunch of members who had left to become lobbyists, the average salary increase for those members they tracked was 1,452%. So in the system where everybody, staffers and members and bureaucrats, depends upon the system surviving, one could fairly ask the question, how could we ever imagine them changing the system? And the point is that it's conceptually simple to understand how to fix this system, but change may well be impossible given the interests that have baked themselves into the system. But not all of these problems are even conceptually simple to solve. So with drug research, citizen-funded campaigns might be cheap, but citizen-funded drug research would not be cheap. We're not going to imagine the government writing a check for all the clinical trials necessary to certify drugs right now. And in the context of journalism in particular, it's not easy because we have a very strict version of free speech burdening the opportunity for regulation that make it practically impossible for the government to intervene in this market in a way that could address some of the dynamics that have evolved. So the remedies here are complex, but the challenge for policymakers who depend upon being trusted and being trustworthy is to think about the way in which their alteration of the incentives around these institutions restore this idea of trust. Okay, so here's the concluding concept, right? So corruption progresses. We go from old-style illegal corruption to legal corruption. The problem is it's not clear that the capacity to remedy these corruptions progresses equally. Indeed, it might be that institutions like the United States Congress lose the capacity to address the corruption because it's evolved into a legal form rather than an illegal form. And so the challenge here, the challenge of the integrity and independence of the policymakers, is to understand how that corruption could be remedied, at least in the context of the United States. And here, as I stand outside of the United States, I will confess to you, I think it's an impossibly difficult challenge. Thanks very much.